we'll have time to work on lab 21. I think that's where we didn't get too much of 21, did we? Okay. Yeah, then we'll work on 21, and then we'll continue on with everything on Wednesday. Just homework, start writing up those objectives. Okay, so let's pick up where we left off. Here. Right, we finished Buffon. And then got to layout, I think. Okay. So back in the 1800s, people were beginning to study fossils. And Lyell, again, a lot of other people around the world thought the Earth was maybe like 2,000 years old, and Lyell was like, I actually think it's like 6,000 years old. And everybody was like, oh my gosh, no way. And so really at this time it was like the Earth's probably a lot older than we think it is. Now we know the Earth is about 4.6. They hypothetically think it's about 4.6 billion years. So even this was, you know, not very big in terms of ideas. And then Lamarck was one of the first that we have written about the idea of adaptation, that the characteristics that you have right now make you either well-suited to survive in the environment or make you not well-suited to survive in the environment. And that's what adaptation means. Adaptation is kind of a funny, I always thought it was a funny choice of words for this concept of having the characteristics that make you able to survive easy, because it sounds like you have control over that, right? Like when we think of adapt, if I said to you, you gotta adapt to studying for this class, you would probably try to make some changes. But in evolution, adaptation really just refers to like you have what you have in terms of your traits and your characteristics, and if you can survive based on the traits that you have, then you are well adapted. So there's no changing. It's just like how you match up with the environment. So that's really what adaptation means when we're talking in evolution. So a little bit different than what we might think of in our everyday use of terms. Lamarck also had a goofy idea in terms of evolution. Lamarck proposed the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So one of the things that I really like about biology as word choice is that oftentimes word choice has meaning and it's intentionally chosen. That if we look at this idea of inheritance, what we know about that term is that we know inheritance is based in the genetics, the DNA that you have, and what you have received from your biological parents. The term acquired means that you're getting that from somewhere else. And characteristics, what we know about characteristics is those are based in inheritance. Can you acquire your DNA, your traits, and your genes? No, you can't acquire those. You have whatever has been given to you. So right there in the name, it kind of is like, no, that acquired makes this whole thing goofy. This idea was, let's say that I'm pregnant and I'm going to have a kid, and I dye my hair blue. Based on what Lamarck is proposing here, is that I would have a child with blue hair. Can that be? Can I dye my hair blue and then the kid comes out with blue hair? No, right? No, the kid's gonna have whatever genetics me and my partner give them. So this was a goofy concept. And that's one of the things about these big ideas, especially when we're talking about evolution, is that a lot of people would talk and pontificate, philosophize, and then scientists would have data to show, no, this is really what's going on. So not a really great idea. All right, so we get into two famous people who have ideas that are written about the most now, But I would say in 20 years, we're going to have a lot of other people from other cultures, and they're going to show the parallels of like this was all happening around the world. So Charles Darwin is kind of a placeholder for the first big ideas about actual adaptation, natural selection, and evolution. So Charles Darwin, kind of interesting background about Charles was that he came from an higher class in England. There was a lot of classism in terms of prejudice there, and his father was a doctor. He saw that Charles was really smart. He was like, Charles, you are going to be a doctor just like me. And Charles was like, I don't really like working on humans, and I don't like the sight of blood. Blood makes me really queasy, and I don't think I'll do very well. And his dad was like, no, you'll be a doctor, right? I'm sure some of you have parents who are like, you will be this, and you're like, oh, I don't want to do that. So Charles is like, okay, so he goes to medical school, and he gets into, he's observing a surgery, and they cut the person open, and he sees blood, and he passes out. And it happens again, and he passes out. And he keeps passing out at the sight of blood, and he was like, I cannot be a doctor, because I can't deal with the sight of blood. And so his dad was like, oh. So at this time, there were voyages that were happening around the world. And people got on ships, and they went and they explored all the different areas. They wanted to know what are all these, what kind of land masses are out there. A lot of it was like, what kind of land masses are out there so we can take them over. We know how that turns out. So one of the things about these explorations was that there was a lot of classism issues on those voyages. The captain was of a high class and the crew was of a lower class. And because people are just silly humans, the captain would be like, I cannot talk to my crew because I am of a higher class. And one of the things that we need as humans is we need human contact. We need to be able to talk to other people. And that was like one of the many reasons why COVID was really hard, because a lot of us just sat behind screens and we didn't have enough contact with other humans. And that actually messes with our mental health. And so these captains would literally go crazy because they refused to talk to their crew socially. I mean, that's just dumb, right? Because they are like, I am better than you. So anyway, to alleviate that situation, instead of just the captains actually treating their crew like equal humans, they were like, no, I need to get someone who's on my level. And they started to recruit naturalists to come on board. And naturalists who were of the same class as the captain would be the social companion to the captain. So right about that time when Charles was like, I can't do this medical school thing, he got a job as a naturalist and got on one of these voyages. And everywhere that Charles went around the world, he noticed that there were organisms that were similar to the ones that he saw at home, but they were different, and the way they were different matched the environment that they were living in. So for example, back in Europe, where he was from, there were rabbits, they called them hares. And the hares, they had really long hair or fur. And they were kind of chubby, they had a lot of fat on them. Because back in England, it was cold. And they had these little short ears. And when he went to South America, what he saw is he saw these rabbits, and they were really, really skinny, and they had really short fur, and they had these really big ears. And it was hot. And what he was noticing was that where it's cold, to have thick fur, like a nice warm coat, and have a lot of fat would keep you warm. Ears were short because what ears do is ears, like appendages, like arms and legs, they often will lose heat really quickly. That's why sometimes the first things that get cold when you go outside is like your hands, your nose, things that are kind of sticking off your body. And so we lose heat to the things that are like furthest off our body. So we don't want to do that, right? That wouldn't be favored in a cold environment. So they have really, really short ears and short arms and short legs. And then this one has these really big ears. And that big ears, it could radiate heat, just let it go off the body in a hot environment to allow them to be cooler. And they were skinny, they didn't have much fat on them, and they didn't have much fur. And he was like, but they look really similar. But their characteristics or traits match the environment to which they live. And he noticed this about different groups of animals everywhere he went. So he, again, that idea of adaptation, he was like, yeah, that adaptation idea, that's like a good thing. I get that. Like your traits and characteristics match how well you survive in your environment. Or don't. The climate, the environment, nature selects for those with the best adaptations or traits. So he started to put together this idea of nature selects for organisms who have traits that match their precise environment. Your traits that make you easily survive in that given nature. So he started to put together some ideas. He also confirmed, like, yeah, I think it takes a lot longer. I think like the Earth is a lot older than what everybody thinks. So he was confirming Buffon's ideas that the Earth's probably pretty old. He collected a lot of fossils. He looked at a lot of organisms. He had books and books and books in which he would draw out what he saw and take notes. One of the most famous studies that he did was on the Galapagos Islands. So just looking back here at this map. The Galapagos Islands are here. And a lot of what he studied up here in England, and then he went to the mainland of South America. By the time he got to the Galapagos, he had some ideas about, okay, it's cold up here, and then these areas around the equator, animals and plants, animals, fungus, everything is going to be adapted to a hot environment. But when we get down into here, they're going to be adapted to colder environments and colder environments up here. And so he started to do a lot of comparisons. So oftentimes when you read about Charles Darwin, he'll say we'll talk about the finches, but there were certainly a lot of other animals like the hare and the rabbit, or the marine and green iguana. On the mainland of South America where it was warm, he would see this kind of lizard, and it was bright green, and it was very skinny. It had a big throat pouch, and it lived up in trees, and it could climb well. He noticed that the green iguana was eating a lot of fruits, vegetables, plant matter. The marine iguana. When you see marine, it means ocean. This type of iguana, it eats algae in the ocean. Ocean water is very salty. Salt water can dehydrate us really easily. So they have a few strategies for getting that algae that's sitting in salt water. The algae grows on rocks in the water. So they have to be really, really good swimmers. So they were really stout, and they were just like super muscular, like all muscle. They had a much stout or bigger body than the green iguana. The green iguana wanted to be slim to be able to climb up and down trees. It wanted to be lighter because it had to pull its body up and down the trees. whereas they needed to have a lot of muscles for swimming against the ocean currents. They also, the algae growing on rocks, in order to get the algae, they had really long fingers and claws for holding onto rocks. And then on the top of their heads, you see those spiky things. They would use this big giant head and the spikes to scrape algae off the rocks. Their mouth, they would grab that algae. When they would get out of the water, because they were getting a lot of salt with their food, they would do this. That's snot, mucus. Their heads are also a lot bigger than the green iguana because they have a lot of mucus glands inside of their head. And what the mucus was doing there is the mucus is holding onto or grabbing the salt before it goes down their throat. And so they would release all of that salt by snotting out mucus with salt on it so they wouldn't get sick. And so again, just like other ways that he looked at animals that looked alike but were best suited or adapted to living in their particular environment. We don't often hear about like the hares or the iguanas, but what we do often hear about in terms of his studies on adaptation is we often hear about the finches, which are birds. So Darwin's finches, these were a group of different kinds of birds that he looked at both in South America on the mainland, but also on a chain of islands in the Galapagos. And what he noticed that the birds on the mainland looked very similar to the birds out on the Galapagos Islands. And one of the things that he proposed in terms of the age of land was that he was like, okay, I think that these big land masses are much older than all of these islands. One of the things we know about islands is that islands form by fissures in the crust of the earth underwater, and lava comes up and it forms these islands. And so island chains are much younger in terms of age than the big continental land masses. He saw that the finches were very similar out on the land, the main land masses and these island land masses. And the one thing that he was like, what was really different was their beaks. And their beaks were all well suited or precisely adapted to the kind of food that they were eating. So that when you have a finch that was eating really hard, tough seeds, they had a really big, strong beak that they could crush them open. And when you had a bird that was eating around cactus spines and picking off of cacti, that they had a long, skinny beak, or one that is eating and picking insects from little cracks and crevices, had also a very, very, very long, skinny beak. Vegetarian finches, they had these serrations in their beaks so that they could tear very thick plant material apart. So that he saw, depending on the food that was available on the island or on the main landmass, would depend on what the beak looked like. They matched really well together. So again, not only did these finches resemble finches on the mainland of South America, but also the finches had traits that made them precisely adapted to living in the environment where they lived. Okay, so Darwin comes back from this long voyage and he is so excited. You know how when you have like great ideas and you go to someone and you're like, oh my gosh, I have the greatest idea, and then they go, that's dumb. And don't you feel just like, oh, come I have such a great idea. Well, not only did Darwin feel that with just like some people, but everybody in his society when he came back and he was like, oh my gosh, this and this are related. He was showing pictures and they're like, no, there's no way this is going on. And he started to talk about natural selection and evolution and species change and all this, and people were like, that, no way. And they shunned him. They called him crazy. And Darwin was like, but I have all this data and stuff, it's so cool. And they didn't want to hear it at that time. 16 years later, he's in his lab. He's just like sorting through all of the stuff he collected, and he's writing papers, and he's just going about his day and kind of just like trying to survive being shunned by the entire society. And he gets a paper by this guy here, Alfred Wallace. And Alfred Wallace, who also was an explorer, a naturalist, had all these same ideas. And Darwin was like, ah, people are publishing things that are like what I discovered. He's like, I gotta get with this guy because he is confirming all the things that I believe. And people were starting to get together and make conferences about evolution. People from all over the world were saying, yeah, I agree. I went on this voyage. I figured out this. I've been noticing this in my area. All over the world, people were saying, I have these same ideas. And so finally, Darwin's like, how come y'all 16 years ago couldn't get on board with what I was saying? But great ideas, sometimes they're just, people aren't ready for them. So, Wallace and Darwin, and again, this is like culturally all over the world. People are confirming not only these two, their ideas, but a lot of explorers, a lot of scientists are coming together and saying these things that they figured out independently of everybody else, and they're like, yeah. And they're confirming independent ideas as these big ideas about evolution. So, a lot of people travel all over. Even if we're just talking about like maybe some people, there are a lot of Middle Eastern scientists, evolutionists who confirm this. There is more and more data coming out, especially in the Middle East, that they traveled around, let's just say the Middle East, and collected these ideas. So people had traveled around and they had studied different organisms. And they noticed that sometimes in different places that were drastically different, that organisms only differed on a few specific traits, and those different traits were well adapted to each of their particular environments. They also noticed that the distribution of things, that there had to be some kind of connection between this here from South America and this here all the way up in England. That even though they were distributed very far away, something had to go on, and we'll get to that piece of the big idea in just a little bit, that distribution issue. Fossils. People were collecting more and more and more fossils and showing each other that here's evidence from things from the past and now, and not only just these two that are living in current times, but then they started to show fossils of different kinds of hares and rabbits and the changes that had happened from way back when to these current times here. And a lot of people started to go, yeah, I think the Earth is a lot older than everybody originally thought. And by 1858, like 175-ish years ago, people were really coming together in groups and like getting these ideas about evolution out there. Crazy idea at the time was that species change over time. So it does sound a little crazy, right? Species changing over time. How do they change? Well, then you have to start to think about bigger, longer processes in terms of changes over time. And one of the things that we came to the conclusion of was natural selection. So the way that natural selection works and allows species to change over time. It's not magic, and it doesn't happen quickly. These are long processes. So, for example, let's say that with us right now, so humans, we will take a look at some of our ancient ancestors, and some of the illustrations, what we see is that they were a lot shorter. They had fur all over their bodies. They, ancient humans walked on like fours, like used their forelimbs for walking. That they weren't, there was only a few groups of Homo sapiens, well, excuse me, there's only one group of Homo sapiens, but there was only a few groups of humans that walked upright. Most of them were hunched over. And so we had changed over time because of our environments. So let's think about humans today, that we're doing well. I mean, not all humans are doing well, but in general, on the earth, humans, we as a population on the earth, our numbers keep going up, right? We keep growing, which means that whatever form we're in right now, we have advantageous traits given the current environment because we keep reproducing and adding on to our population. But let's say the environment changes drastically and suddenly. Let's say that the earth is flooded so much that there's so much water that even buildings are covered. So unless you're lucky enough to get on a boat, the rest of us, what are we doing? We're going to be swimming. When we think about survival of organisms, one of the main things that we do immediately to help our survival is eat, right? We have to fuel all of the processes that happen in our body. So if the earth is completely covered in water, can we just go up to McDonald's or a grocery store and get our food the way we do right now? No, right? That's all underwater. So how good do you think you would be if the earth had miles of water on it? How good do you think you would be at finding food in a completely flooded environment? I know I wouldn't be very good. Can you, just like with your hands, if it just flooded suddenly and we're swimming, I mean, is your phone gonna help you catch fish? Or some kind of food or algae, right? Are you gonna suddenly adapt well if you're like, okay, I gotta eat algae and fish? Well, maybe you start eating algae, but algae doesn't have a ton of calories. Are you gonna be able to find enough algae to survive? Probably not. A lot of us are gonna die really, really quickly. A lot of us are going to drown because we're not strong enough swimmers, and a lot of us aren't going to be able to find food. So let's say that you're like doing okay. You are decent at swimming. You can get that air. You can find enough like algae. Maybe find some shrimp, some crabs and clams, and you can get by. Do you think it's going to be easy to survive? I think anybody's just going to be like, I mean, some people might be a little more skilled, right? But for the most part, like us here, any of you confident that you're just going to have an easy time surviving? Anybody? I'm not. I'm a good swimmer. I'm actually a marine biologist, and I know I'm going to have a really hard time. Do you think, given this change in the environment, that your focus will be on reproduction? That if you are swimming hard, trying so hard to find food, that your brain is like, I want to reproduce right now. I'm gonna go swim and find a mate and bring offspring into this really hard, awful situation. No, right? So when the environment changes and organisms are not having an easy time surviving because they just don't have the characteristics that match up well with the change of the environment, survival is number one. Hard survival means no reproduction. So humans, it would be interesting to see what kind of humans could survive this drastic change in the environment and what they look like. I'm gonna guess they might be like kind of muscular, maybe people who lived by the ocean, and they're going to look drastically different than what we look right now, right? They're going to have specific characteristics that fit the environment that has changed. So a lot of traits and characteristics are going to like die off. A lot of us are going to die. Maybe all of us will die. Sometimes the environment changes really fast and all the organisms, most of them die off. Species go extinct. Extinction is a natural part of evolution. Over 90% of all species that have ever lived have gone extinct. That's huge, right? It might have been closer to 99%. That when the environment changes, a lot of species don't make it. They just don't have the good characteristics. So, natural selection. The focus is environment selects for those that have good traits right now. Environment changes. Those that are selected for, the traits of them can be drastically different as a group than the whole group itself. Another example of natural selection. There have been these major extinction events that have happened about 6 times throughout the history of life. One example, the last major extinction event was when the dinosaurs, when they were roaming the earth, when being really, really large was selected for. Plants were really, really big, which means that the herbivores, the animals that were feeding on the big plants, they were really, really, really big. Then you had omnivores. Omnivores mean they eat plants and they eat animals. And they were kind of like medium-sized. And then you had the carnivores, or the major predators, and they were kind of medium-sized too. So one day, a giant meteorite, it hits the Yucatan Peninsula. And that meteorite is so large that it stirs up all this dust. A really unique thing about our Earth and where we live is that it is in the right position from the sun. And so in that position from the sun, it keeps us just warm enough, not too hot, not too cold, to favor life here. The other thing that's unique about our Earth is that we have this bubble atmosphere, and it holds in heat, and it allows water to circulate. And we have just enough heat that's held in to allow things to thrive here. Now, we know we're messing that up as humans, but this is a whole other issue that we won't talk about. But our little bubble, when that meteorite struck and it stirred up all of this dust, dust covered our bubble, our atmosphere. And a lot of UV light was not filtering in. Some, a little bit. So what happened to the really big plants is that the really big plants were not getting enough sunlight, and they started to die off. Some small plants were making it, but small plants were not enough for the giant herbivore dinosaurs. And so the giant herbivores, they start to die off because they don't have enough food. The omnivores, they were like, uh-oh, plants are dying off. I guess we'll focus on being carnivores for a while. But then all of the herbivores die off. And then the omnivores, they start getting eaten by the predators. And then they start to die off, and then the predators start to eat each other. And then all the dinosaurs are dead. So how did life continue on? At the time that the dinosaurs were really, really big, mammals had evolved. There were small mammals. And the mammals, they were like little snacks for dinosaurs. And they didn't want to get eaten, so those mammals who just happen to have characteristics where they had fur on their body, and they had big eyes, and they could dig or climb, they stayed out of the way of the dinosaurs during the day. The thing about the dinosaurs was that they were exotherms. And when you were an exotherm type organism, you lose heat to your environment. You can't keep yourself warm. So during the day, they'd have to get warm from the sun, and then when the sun went down, their metabolism would slow down, they'd get tired, and they'd go to sleep at night. But the mammals who had fur, they happen to have furry bodies, they could go out at night when the dinosaurs were sleeping. And they had big eyes, so the little bits of sunlight from the moon, they could run around, and they could live their lives at night. They were out of the way of the dinosaurs. These dinosaurs start to go extinct, and the mammals are like, woohoo! Those things that could eat us during the day, we could start to live during the day and the night, and the dinosaurs totally die off, and then we have the rise of the mammal group. So, nothing magical there, right? Just traits that are favored given what is happening in the environment. That's natural selection. Okay, so let's take a look at this question here. The existence of species of flightless birds with wings suggests, so like a penguin is a flightless bird. Penguins are real chubby. They have a lot of fat. They live in really cold waters. They have a lot of feathers, and their feathers, one of the things about their feathers is their feathers are coated in a waxy oil. And what that waxy oil does is it creates like a layer of feathers, and then they have pockets of air between their feathers and their skin. And air gets trapped inside of there, and it gets warmed up by their bodies. And so they have like a warm bubble around their body. The wax on their feathers also makes them waterproof. So when they go into water, they've got not only fat on their body, they've got a warm air layer, and then they've got this waterproof coating. So they don't feel the cold like you and I would jump into cold water. We'd be like, woo, right? So they have a lot of strategies for living in cold water. They live in water. Their wings that are normally for flying, what are they good for? Swimming, good. So they're very good swimmers. So let's think a little bit about their relationship, even though they are still birds, but they look more like maybe like a seal or a dolphin, right? So they have characteristics that are closer to things that might be in the water, but do you think that they are not related to flying birds? We know they're birds. We actually know that penguins are birds. Do you think maybe they are descended from flying birds but have adapted to their particular environment? That sounds really nice, doesn't it? They have a lot of traits that suit them in the environment in which they live. Flying does not suit them. Swimming does. They are more related to bats than to flying birds. That might sound like maybe, but no. I don't know. We do know they're birds and bats are something different. They are closely related to fish, but are evolving to become flying birds. That just sounds like a whole bunch of nonsense, doesn't it? They were created in a lab. So which one is the best answer for this question? Good, B. So B is the best answer. So let's talk about what everyone was agreeing on. And again, Darwin, Wallace, lots of other evolutionists at the time. There are 3 principles of nature that lead to evolution by natural selection. So we're putting all these terms together here. So one is that traits are passed on from parent to offspring. We know traits are in our DNA. They are characteristics that we find in our genes. Our genes are made up of DNA, which is made up of the A's and the T's and the G's and the C nucleotides. And we know that we as a species get our traits from sperm and egg or dad and mom. So we know that evolution is based in DNA and genetics. Inheritance is the basis of evolution. What genes code for what traits, which are particularly adapted in the environment right now. So genetics plays an enormous role in evolution. At the time, people didn't understand that quite. They didn't know about DNA and nucleotides and all that, but they did kind of go, well, these 2 parents, the offspring does look a lot like them and does have some traits that are similar to mom and similar to dad. So there's got to be some passing down of something from parents to offspring. That was about all they could say at that time. And eventually get to like the early 1900s and people start to kind of rock and roll with the ideas of what is this inheritance, and eventually we get to knowing what DNA is today. Okay, principle 2. More offspring are produced than are able to survive. Resources that are around are limited, and organisms compete for those resources. If you have an easy time getting your resources, you have time to reproduce, time to pass on those advantageous traits. if you are an offspring and you cannot get the resources that you need to survive, you're probably not going to reproduce. So there are usually more organisms in a population that can survive on the limited resources that we have. And then it just depends on who's going to reproduce. The ones with the beneficial traits, the ones without the beneficial traits are having a hard time surviving, so they don't pass on those traits. So not everybody reproduces because not everybody is favored. Everybody doesn't have time to reproduce. Individuals who are having a hard time surviving may even choose. They'd be like, I survive okay, but do I want to? Like, I can get some of the limited resources, but not all of them. Do I want to bring offspring into this? So some organisms may not be able to reproduce, and some may choose not to. Survival and reproduction match up with beneficial traits. So again, if you have the advantageous traits, you are surviving easily, you have time to reproduce. You pass on the good traits to your offspring. So these are kind of the basic ideas about how and why nature selects for those who are well adapted or have advantageous traits. All right, just continuing on a little bit about that last principle too. There's diversity in the traits that organisms have. If we look around, we are the same species, but we look different. I am starting to get to know your individual names, and I can remember your names because you look like you, as opposed to looking like someone else in the room. We are all different enough. Variation and diversity is really important in a population, because the more diverse we are, the more different kinds of traits. If the environment suddenly changes, let's hope that some of us can survive that change. If we are all super similar and the environment changes, it could knock everybody out. So we always hope for diversity in populations. So just taking a look at, for example, this snail population, that all species, generally, you will find diversity among them. When there's not diversity, it usually means like tough survival. But here, like if we just look at these, just like us, right? Every one of these is different. Do you see two that are exactly alike? Probably not. You have different colors, different patterns, different colored patterns within one group. All right, so a little bit back about this big idea about evolution, that we are descended from organisms of the past. Climate change has always been happening. Nature has always been changing. So when people say things like, I don't believe in climate change, it's like, well, we have data that shows that when we go back 4 billion years of the Earth, that there was a lot of water on the Earth, there was a lot of energetic sources, that the Earth was very different than it is today. That's climate changing. Climate change happens. So we know that we, as a species, different things over time were favored, and that's just like the climate changing, the traits that were favored, the crapshoot that we are what we are today. The proportions of certain traits are higher. The proportions of traits that are high reflect if that trait helps us survive. So right now as humans, we don't have fur. We are a mammal. A lot of mammals have fur. But we have had the ability to use tools, and tool use has allowed us to do things like sew, and we could put on clothes to go outside. Tool use has allowed us to build buildings and make heat and air conditioning. And so we don't need fur anymore. That trait is not selected for. So the proportion of furry humans, it's pretty much gone. Having no fur is selected for because of our tool use over time. So the proportion of different traits changes with what is selected for in the environment over time. That's why it was really important to look back at fossils and see what traits match up with what happened in the environment at that time. Evolution and species change over time. The idea of this part of evolution, that species change over time, is the theory portion of evolution. A theory. The term theory can be interchanged with law or principle in science. A theory, a law, a principle says that a lot of scientists have done a lot of research, and there's a lot of data, and they all come to the same conclusion based on the current evidence of today. So if we go back to the time of Darwin and Wallace, and when they came up with the idea that parents had traits and they passed them on to offspring, people were like, okay, we're just calling it traits are passed on. And then that theory that traits were passed on to offspring changes with the technology. That when we had started to get things like microscopes, and we have the ability to carbon date, and we have the ability to look into molecules, with those technology come more names for the idea of traits. Then we get DNA, and then we get nucleotides, and even nucleotides, we get what are the parts of the nucleotides, and then what are the parts of the parts, and we start to name things with changes in technology. So we do know that theories can be tweaked depending on new technologies that we have. There is lots of evidence for evolution, and when we're talking about the theory portion of evolution, we mean that we can use all of these pieces of evidence to support that species change over time based on environmental conditions or natural selection. When we are talking about the theory of evolution, we do not mean how life started. How life started is a hypothetical part of evolution. We do not have data to say this is how life started. But we do have all of this evidence to show that species change over time by natural selection. So we're going to take a look at, and this is what you started, well, no, we didn't even start yet. We will start to do in Lab 21. You're going to look at fossils. Fossils are rocks that can be dated. These rocks come from pieces of living things. Fossils can show a progression of a species over time. You can look at what did humans look like 6 million years ago, 5 million years ago, 4 million years ago, and we can kind of show what traits were favored and figure out why, depending on what part of the world those humans lived in. You'll take a look at Archaeopteryx today. Archaeopteryx is a species that has both bird and reptile characteristics. I'm going to go to this for a second. We also, hypothetically, sometimes this works out, that fossils that are deeper are older than fossils that are higher. So like in this area of the Grand Canyon, for example, they might find species that lived in water very deep in the layers of sediment, and then there are certain kinds of plants that are land plants are found much higher up, and then we find dinosaur bones much higher up. Depending on water movement, sometimes things are lower or higher, just depending on the movement of water. So this is not always completely perfectly said that deeper things are older, just depends on that area. Other things that we're looking for in terms of fossil, not just bones. When a paleontologist goes to a dig and they're looking around, they find a bone, here's what else they're starting to look for. And in terms of paleontologists, you'll have people who are specifically trained to look for eggs, feces, bones, footprints, handprints, arm prints, feather prints, fur prints, skin impressions. So you have all kinds of different paleontologists. And each of these pieces of evidence gives you an idea of what that dinosaur may have looked like. So if you go to the Field Museum and you see a dinosaur like that, the way that they got that idea is from all of these different pieces of evidence that were gathered by many, many different specialty paleontologists. And they put together pictures. That's why sometimes you might go, like maybe you went to the Field Museum as a kid and you saw that the T-Rex looked a certain way and now it looks a little bit different. Because there were more discoveries of this kind of stuff that gives a better picture of what that animal actually looked like. We look at comparative anatomy. We can compare the structures on organisms between members of the same groups. You will see different members of the vertebrates in lab. In general, evolution changes organisms very slowly because usually climate change, the changes are not as fast as my example of going from living on land to having thousands of feet of water. Usually the changes are subtle over time and gradual. So if we take a look at, for example, different skulls, which you'll do in lab, and we look at relatives to humans like the gorilla, we can take a look at what our skulls look like and get an idea of what suited us best as humans. So some of the things that you will look at the teeth of all of the different primates, and then you'll think about like what suits them best. So in humans, because we learned to use tools, and we could use spears for catching our food, or rocks, or bows, and we use these different tools, we had less of a need to have these giant teeth for grabbing onto our prey. We could use tools to do that. So our teeth get much smaller. Small teeth are favored by our human ancestors as opposed to the great apes. The size of the jaw, we don't need to have such a big, strong jaw. So our jaw size gets much smaller over time, and their jaw bigger. Take a look, I always like to look at when you're comparing species, what takes up a lot of, I like to say, real estate or space on that organism can give you an idea of how do they live. So for humans, right, we have tools, so we don't need to have these big giant teeth and jaws and mouths anymore. But they do, in the way that they get their food. What takes up the majority of the real estate on a human head? The brain, right? So the brain size gets a lot bigger. What takes up the majority, or at least half of the real estate, right? The jaw is even bigger than the brain cavity. So with our ability for cognition and the use of tools, our brain got bigger, we got to use more tools, which made things that we have on our jaw need to get smaller rather than bigger. Humans have a pretty flat face, as opposed to gorillas, they have a snout. It comes out because they have a lot of things that they need here in that jaw area. If you feel where your eyebrows are, there's a little tiny brow ridge, just a little tiny bit. If you take a look at this gorilla here, the brow ridge is quite large. And the brow ridge, it's a good block for the rest of the skull, can help to protect the back of the skull. Especially it's good for protection when you're going and you're chasing down another animal. So, if this morning, if you had to go out and catch a squirrel with your mouth and your hands, that squirrel has little claws and things, right? Could they claw at the rest of your head? Potentially, right? So a brow ridge would help to protect the back of the head, but we don't need that anymore. And the brain size, humans, in comparison to a gorilla, this is the human brain. The big one here is the human brain. Our brain is a lot bigger than the gorilla brain, even though the gorilla skull is a lot bigger. We have a lot more real estate to our brain. All right, let's talk about limbs. When we are talking about limbs, we are going to focus on related organisms. We are going to focus on the vertebrates. A vertebrate animal has a backbone. We are going to focus on the vertebrates in two ways. Let me back this up a second. We are going to look at skulls, and we are going to see and compare amongst vertebrates, those that have a backbone, how and where the foramen magnum inserts into the skull. Okay, so the foramen magnum, it is the hole in the bottom of the skull where our backbone goes into our skull. For humans, our foramen magnum is right underneath. It's like this because we walk around, right? When my chin is parallel, my foramen magnum is like this. It goes up into my skull. Now, if I'm a gorilla and my stature is more like this, is my foramen magnum going straight up into my skull? No, it's a little bit angular, isn't it? Because if I walk around like this, it is more comfortable for my foramen magnum to go on an angle. And if I'm a turtle and I walk around like this, my foramen magnum is behind my skull. So depending on the lifestyle of the vertebrate, the foramen magnum can be behind, angular, or underneath. So we will look at that. We will also look at the structure of the forelimbs. Forelimbs, we're going to look at the front or forelimbs. So for us, our forelimbs are our arms. Whenever you're looking at these animals, regardless of whether you're looking at the skull and the position of the foramen magnum or you're looking at the structure of the forelimbs, try and think about the lifestyle of that particular animal and its stature and things that it does and how it rests comfortably in the environment. That will give you an idea of why and how certain things look the way they do. For all vertebrates, this is a really great picture and you have it on the next page. All vertebrates have the same forelimb bone structure. They have a humerus, radius is on the thumb side, ulna is on the pinky side. So within this part of my arm, in the human, I can see the ulna here, the radius is on the thumb side, ulna is on the other side. So in this part of my arm, I have this radius here and the ulna here. The carpals are the wrist, the metacarpals are the hand part, and the phalanges are the finger. So we always have the humerus, the radius on the thumb side, the ulna on the other side, the carpals for bending, the metacarpals are usually pretty straight, and the phalanges. So think about if I'm a chicken, this is my humerus, right? So my wing, and you think about also, if you're trying to figure out which side is the radius side, that a chicken wing, they're usually like this, right? So sometimes it helps to be the animal and be like, okay, right, a chicken wouldn't be like that. The radius wouldn't be on the outside, it would be on the inside because it would be more comfortable the way they exist in the world like this, right? And they walk around like that. So if you're having a hard time trying to figure out what's where, be the animal for a second. Or if you don't want to embarrass yourself, you can ask me. I'll walk around. I'll be your chicken. No problem. Okay, so we have what are called homologous structures. This term homologous, we use it often in biology. If you took Bio 111, you're like, oh yeah, homologous chromosomes, right? The term homologous means similar or same. When we have homologous evolutionary structures, it means that they are used for similar reasons, they are found in similar places. The thing about homologous structures is that your homologous structures show a common ancestor. They show an evolutionary relationship. Okay, so we have a bunch of mutations that happen that lead to the vertebrates. And that first group of vertebrates, what happens is that they go into an area, so just like the mammals, right? Dinosaurs start to die off, the mammals start to come out during the day, they get to go to places, they get to invade habitats they could never before, because now those predators aren't going to eat them like pieces of popcorn, as they can go off into different environments. So we have some mutations that lead to the vertebrates, and this group in this new environment, they start to reproduce. Could be because, just like the mammals, is that once there are no giant predators trying to eat them, they survive much easier, right? So now, with having all of the little foods that are left from the dinosaurs and not that pressure to be eaten all the time, they have a lot less stress in their survival, so they can start to reproduce a lot. And so our common ancestor of our vertebrates, they go into an area, they start to proliferate, their stress of survival is low, and they start to reproduce and reproduce and reproduce. And oftentimes when organisms go into a new place where the stress of survival is low, they will start to show what's called exponential growth. And we'll get to this when we talk ecology at the end of the semester, but with little stress of survival, you start to reproduce a lot. And then when you start to reproduce a lot, eventually you get to problems. You start to get overcrowding. You start to get diseases. It's easier for predators to see you because there's a lot of you. There's competition for resources amongst you all. And so eventually survival starts to get hard. There's a couple things that can happen. One is that you die. Two is you go like, hey, you know what? My traits would allow me to go over in this environment and do better. So some of the vertebrates are like, I have traits where it's easier for me to go live on that land way over there. And some of them will leave because of the stresses of survival, because they have certain traits that suit them better over there. And some of them will be like, well, I have claws, and I'm small and light, so I can climb up in trees. And some of them swim better, so they go off and they swim. And some of them can fly. I mean, it's not that instantaneous, all of this, but eventually what happens with the vertebrates is that when our common ancestry group, when things start to get stressful in survival, some of them leave, and over time, the powers of natural selection and the traits that are selected for in different environments lead to the diversity of all these different four-limb traits. This takes a long, 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 long time. We're talking millions and millions of years. So, when we're talking about, did I say? Okay. One example like this, the forelimbs, the skull structures of vertebrates. They differ depending on the environment that we live in. What we call this kind of evolution is we call this divergent evolution. Everybody is diverging or going away from the common ancestor main traits. Right? When you diverge, you go away. So homologous structures show a common ancestor and divergent evolution. Okay, so now there's also vestigial or vestigial, however you want to say that. I was taught vestigial, so I say vestigial, but you may say vestigial structures. From our common ancestor here, we may still have remnants of traits that were important to their survival, but for us are not important anymore. These kinds of traits, vestigial traits, serve no purpose to us right now, but they give us a little clue about what our common ancestor looked like. So we retain pieces of traits from our common ancestry, but we don't need them for our survival right now. They show also divergent evolution. They show that going away from the traits of the common ancestor. So, let's say over here that we have some vertebrates and they're better suited to swimming. And there are two whales, and I'm a female, and I can choose this whale who has no legs, or I could choose this whale. Let's think about hips. Our hips, what do they support? Legs, right? The legs come out of the hips. So, this whale here has these bones that legs hung from. This whale here, for whatever reason, their parents' legs were not selected for, so they eventually, this group of whales, they don't have legs, but they still have hip bones, and those hip bones give us the idea that these whales evolved from vertebrates who once had legs. But swimming, one of the things about fish, if you think about like fish and whales and dolphins, is that they are shaped kind of like this shape, right? Like an eyeball shape. And that shape helps them to glide through water. It makes them hydrodynamic. Would dragging arms and legs be very hydrodynamic? No, right? It's going to slow you down. So if I'm a female, and maybe this one here, super nice, super funny, like spending time with this one, but the predators are almost catching him every time. And so as a female, I have to decide, do I want the funny, witty whale with the legs that the predators are almost always going to eat, or this one who's just kind of boring, but can swim really, really fast, and can get away from predators, and can get me tons of food, and get my offspring tons of food? So evolutionarily, we are inclined to choose the traits that are going to help our offspring survive better. So this one that can swim away from predators and get food, much better than this witty whale who might get eaten by predators, won't have a mate to take care of my offspring or give me more offspring, and won't be able to get my offspring food. So the female over time chooses this trait over that one, and over time this trait in the population dies off because it's not practical for the future, for the offspring. So some whales have, you can see on the next page, that you can see that they are the back page, you can see that some whales, some snakes have hip bones, but they don't have legs, right? Just like Snakes are kind of the same way. They want to slither quickly. Legs would just slow them down. So we can see that due to natural selection, legs in certain vertebrates have not been chosen for. It makes them slower. We want streamlined slithering. We want streamlined swimming. So we will take a look at, you'll look at the bones of a boa constrictor today, but also I'll bring out a real boa constrictor and I'll show you on our boa constrictor where the hip bones, where you can see like a ridge where they exist inside of them. Our wisdom teeth, do any of you not have wisdom teeth? No wisdom teeth? Oh, no wisdom teeth. You're very highly evolved if you do not have wisdom teeth. Wisdom teeth, what they do is that when our jaw has gotten selected for to be smaller over time because we use tools to get our food, but the evolution of our teeth has not quite caught up. In the two of you, for example, it has. But for those of us who have wisdom teeth, what happens is that when you get to be somewhere around about your age, is that your wisdom teeth start to come up. And like, let's say you had braces your whole life. The point of having braces is that we want our teeth aligned really nice and straight so that we don't get a whole bunch of bacteria stuck up in between crevices in our teeth. So crooked teeth will hold more bacteria. Another thing that we are learning is that the microbes, all the microorganisms that live in and on us, contribute to what diseases we will have in our futures. So, one of the most important things that you can do for your health is immediately when you get up, before you take a drink of water, is go brush your teeth. Brush and floss, because you will, even if you have nice straight teeth, you still want to get any bacteria that have grown while you are sleeping, you want to get them out of there. Because some of those bacteria, while many of them are beneficial to your health, some of them will contribute in you to different diseases, like diabetes and heart disease, for example. And so brushing them out, those that have grown all night, gets them out of your body. Wisdom teeth, if you have braces especially, you do not want to just let the wisdom teeth grow in, because what they're going to do, there's not enough room. Our jaw ends about here. This tooth is going to push its way in and push all these teeth forward. It's going to make those beautiful straight teeth go on top of each other. It's going to make them crooked. So you've got to get them out. Or if you were just born lucky with some straight teeth, when your wisdom teeth come up, you got to get them up. But you two don't have to undergo a surgery to have that happen. And it's kind of nice to have less time under anesthesia and undergoing procedures where you could get sick. You could get some kind of disease. So our wisdom teeth are vestigial structures. Our appendix is also a vestigial structure. Relatives of ours are common ancestry of the vertebrates. Some of them would eat whole animals if we go way, way back, right? If we're talking about having to eat like a squirrel, if you were going to eat a squirrel and you didn't have tools to cut it apart and get all the hair and fur and nails and things off, you would just eat those parts in whole. And all of those really hard to digest parts would go into your appendix. And in your appendix, you've got a lot of microorganisms and certain acids and enzymes that would try to break down those very hard to digest things that would be dangerous to go through your digestive system. So another vestigial structure. Okay, so last little piece today. Some unrelated organisms have similar structures. If we think about birds and dragonflies or butterflies, birds are vertebrates, they have a backbone. Birds have the same homologous four-limb structures that we do. A butterfly or a dragonfly, they do not have a backbone. Their wings are about 2 cells thick. They're very, very thin. No bones, 2 cells thick, no backbone. So, but they fly, right? Birds fly. butterflies, dragonflies fly, but they're not very closely related. But they have similar structures, and what we call these structures is we call them analogous. Analogous structures did not develop from a common ancestor. They are showing traits that are converging toward each other. This is an example of what we call convergent evolution. Species that are coming toward each other. The term analogous is like analogies. An analogy shows you a similarity between two things that are not related. So like I could say, since I have red on, I'm like a strawberry. Am I really like a strawberry? No, I just have red and the strawberry's red, right? So we're not very related, but we do have the same color. So it's kind of showing that big difference between two things, trying to make you remember what's similar about two very different things. So again, they show convergent evolution. The lifestyles are similar, but they don't have a close common ancestor. So as my example, the bird and the dragonfly or butterfly, they are not closely related because, for example, their wings are very different in composition.